All right. Is this on? Hello? It is? I'm guessing it is. Okay, so today I'm going to be sharing from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Based on this question, are you mature? Now, all of us here probably don't like it when someone, even 1 month older than us, looks down at us and says, and treats us as if we were a child. We hate it when people treat us like children, especially when it's your parents. No matter how old you've gotten, how mature you think you are, your parents somehow still find a way to treat you as if you are like this, still a little child. And we hate it, right? When I was a sophomore, when I was in college, I decided that I didn't want to be a burden on my parents. So I decided to pay for my own tuition, working part-time jobs. And then I thought, along the way, why don't I just deal with my own meals? I'll pay for what I need to pay for, cook whatever I need to do. And I'll also make sure that I keep up my walk with God. I'll go to church regularly, don't need them to bring me. I'll make sure I pray every day, do my devos, whatever it takes. And so I thought I was well on this way to becoming independent, to becoming mature. And yet when I had a conversation with my dad, he ended up asking me this question, do you think you're mature? And in my head, I'm like, well, I'm basically doing everything on my own, basically independent. Like, I'm only coming home to sleep, and I wake up and I go do what I have to do. I'm responsible for my own actions, for the things that I'm doing. I'd say I'm pretty mature. And then he looks at me and he says, you're still immature. You'll understand when you get more mature. I don't know, like, how do you guys feel when your parents tell you that you're still immature? I'm thinking there's no way. Look at me right now. Do you see me relying on you guys? Do you see me being dependent? I'm doing everything that I need to do. I'm responsible for getting through school, for going to church. How am I not mature in your eyes? Today I still wrestle with the question of what is true maturity. I'm not speaking or sharing with us from someone who has completed and reach the epitome of what maturity is, but as someone who's still learning and on the journey of. But while I'm here, I want to share with us what Paul says from 1 Corinthians chapter 13 on what he believes maturity is. So let's open up to, or look up, to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and I'll read for us. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall fully know, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, but the greatest of these is love. Right from the start, Paul recognizes the context and the culture of the Corinthian church. He's not speaking to deaf ears because he knows exactly what the Corinthian church is going through at this moment. If you look at chapter 12, he's just talked to them about the different spiritual gifts they can have. And he's taught them about how each of the people in the church have their own role to play. And yet here he gives them a very clear warning. You know, I just told you about all those spiritual gifts, but if you were just to act out on them alone, independently, there's no point. You see, these spiritual gifts that everybody was pursuing, that they were praying for, speaking in tongues, prophesying, having great wisdom or faith or knowledge, All these things people sought after. And yet Paul is telling them here, what's the point? If you had all of these things, if you were able to do all of these things, what's the point? They thought that as long as they could do this, as long as they can go in front of the church and prophesy, as long as they could give up their goods, or if they could sacrifice themselves for the church, that it would define them as spiritually mature. It would define them as a true believer. And yet Paul says, there's no point. For us today, we're not a charismatic church here. So that means the first thing we desire isn't to speak in tongues. That's just what happens in this church. And probably the first thing we desire isn't to prophesy, right? That's not on the top of our list of to-do things. But instead, we have our own definitions of what we believe maturity and spiritual maturity to be. Thanks to some of us filling out the survey, I have a general idea that most of us here believes similarly to what I did in college about what maturity is. Right? We think that maturity is independence. When we're able to take care of ourselves, when we're able to pay for our own things, maybe when we live by ourselves, maybe when we're responsible for our own actions, our own decisions, that's how you define someone as mature. And when it comes to spiritual maturity, most of us here probably believe as long as a person is able to produce the fruits of the Spirit, or maybe someone who can go to church regularly or do their devos, read their Bible, pray every day without someone having to force them, that's someone who's spiritually mature. So we have our ideas of what maturity and spiritual maturity looks like. Paul is saying here that there's more to it. Paul is saying here that maturity and spiritual maturity isn't solely defined by how well you can perform these ritualistic acts, nor how well you can care for yourself. There's a key ingredient that he wants all of the Corinthian church to know about. See, maturity and spiritual maturity cannot just be us performing well. And that's what we want to do. We want to do good. We want to do a good job. But that can't be what defines us as mature, spiritually mature. Instead, I believe there's a huge relational aspect that Paul's trying to bring into the picture. And he doesn't just leave the Corinthians hanging, because he then goes and describes love. He tells us what love is. He tells us what love isn't. And then he tells us how love lives out, right? Patience, kindness. That's what love is. Love isn't envious. What else does it say? Love isn't boastful or arrogant or rude, insisting on its own ways, irritable, resentful. We've got a whole list of telling us what love is and isn't. Paul wants the Corinthians to know very clearly about love. And when we look at this, one thing that I realize is that love has to have a target. You see, when Paul says all these things about what they're doing with their spiritual gifts, he's trying to tell them, yeah, it's good that you can do it, but what's the point? If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 9, he says, what's the point of you being able to speak in tongues if no one can understand? If you can pray up here and do all the spiritual tongues and things like that, but if no one understands, it's like you're speaking to the air. Paul wants the Corinthian church to know that there is no point in being able to speak in tongues, to be able to perform well, do spiritual gifts, if you're not considering other people. And that's why love comes in right here. The reality is, we've heard this passage spoken before. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4-7 is very, very popular to be used during weddings. In a wedding, the pastor will probably preach this passage and tell the couples, now this is what love needs to look like. See, you lived this independent life before. You were kind of doing your own thing. But now that you're married, this is what you have to do. You have to all of a sudden go from independence to interdependence. Right? You can't just love yourself and rely on yourself anymore. You have to learn how to depend on the other person, rely on the other person just as much as they will depend and rely on you. Paul introduces this idea of interdependence. Not independence as maturity, but interdependence. This idea that we have to learn how to be considerate of others, learn how to depend on others as much as they rely and depend on us. But for us, we don't do spiritual gifts, right? For us right now, that's not our main thing. But if I were to translate 1 Corinthians 13, 1-3 into our own language, things that we might be thinking or doing, I read this. 1 Corinthians verse 13, 1-3, in the words of Pastor Joseph, from Paul to the modern context. If I live at home under my parents' roof, and yet do my own thing independently while ignoring them, and have not love for them, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I move away from my parents, trying to separate my life from theirs, or if I, as a parent, am constantly trying to control my child's life, but have not love, I am nothing. If I read my Bible and pray every day, going to church regularly, practicing fruits of the Spirit, but have not love, I gain nothing. See, if I look at our context today, doing our own thing independently, just performing Christian acts, if that was all that it was to it, and we don't have love, we don't have consideration for others, it's pointless. But anybody here who has tried to love before knows how difficult it is. If any of you here has tried to love someone else, especially the way that Paul describes here, you know that it's near impossible. More often than none will probably fail. And that's the reality, because each and every one of us here has a limited capacity to love. Taking an example and an analogy from another, probably more famous pastor, I want us to take this water bottle. See, look at this water bottle. See, a little bit of water in it. This water bottle just depicts our capacity to love. Maybe some of you have more water in it. Maybe some of you have less. Right now I have this much left. But every single time you try to love someone else, you open the bottle and you take a sip. First thing is, I gotta love myself, right? So I gotta take a good bit of that. I wanna love my friends, right? They're the ones who I'm gonna hang out with. They're the ones I'm gonna relate with. Some of us wanna love our sports, right? The sports we do. Some of us love the music that you do. I'm gonna say academics, but I don't think that's true. Maybe some of you love your jobs, but that might also be a stretch. But you're going to try to. That's why you're going to take a really big sip here. I also got to love my family, right? But there's nothing left. You see, the reality is each and every one of us has a limited capacity to love. And if we were just to love based on our own abilities, you're going to end up empty. That's just the reality of it. We all can't be expected to love infinitely. We're limited. And so when Paul tells the Corinthians that this is the way you need to love, this is the way that you need to love, they're recognizing this is near impossible. And that's why Paul gives it here, because he wants us to recognize that we can't do it on our own. See, the reality of why love is so difficult is because when we fail, that is when we recognize that we can't do it on our own and we need help. If you read in 1 John, you know that God is love, right? And so when we look at this passage now and we consider each and every one of these aspects that love needs to be, if we can't do it on our own, what Paul wants us to recognize is that we need to rely and depend on God for help. Maturity isn't this independence or this acting independently, but instead it is when we are able and willing to depend and rely on God to supply us. Depend and rely on God's love. Maturity and spiritual maturity isn't just this solo act caring about ourselves, but it's this interdependence with others. Pastors love to use this cross as an example of how we live our life, right? And today, my challenge is this, right? This independent, to take our idea of maturity as independence instead to replace it with this. Maturity as this vertical dependence, relying on God, relying on God's love, to then be horizontally interdependent and loving and caring others. And now as we come to a close, we have verses 8 to 12. And this is where it gets a little confusing. He says a lot of stuff here. But generally, basically, let's just simplify it. This is saying, 8 to 12 is basically saying that love never ends. And that currently, at this moment, we only understand a portion. But at some point, sometime, God will make things more clear. But what I want to focus on here is verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. What are some things that we thought of as children? We think and act differently, right? As children, we probably thought that every Chinese New Year, we'd get money. We'd get red envelopes. That's the benefit of being a child, that when you go visit your cousins, your parents, you get Chinese New Year money. And yet, when you become an adult and you realize that after you get married, that doesn't happen anymore. Last night, I went to meet up with my family. I have like 40-something uncles and cousins and stuff. And they gave me my red envelopes, but then also pointed out that this is the last time I'm getting it. So I guess that's the reality. And then what about some actions, right? When you were younger, when we were children, we probably lifted with our backs, right? That's just the easiest way to lift things up, to bend down and lift it up, right? But then as you get older, as you realize that your lower back is starting to break and hurt, and you're finding more problems with your body, you're realizing that your parents were probably right when they told you to lift with your knees. There's a difference in how we thought and how we acted as a child, and when you become an adult, how you think and act. And so now if we take this in terms of maturity and spiritual maturity, what does this look like? Right? What are some childlike thoughts or actions that we can have? Maybe it's thinking that we can do everything on our own. Maybe some of us here love, or maybe not love, but we like to do things on our own. We don't want to ask for help because we're so capable. And the reality is most of you here probably are. And so it's so much easier just to do things on my own, to do it and successfully do it without having to rely on someone else. Maybe a childlike thought is thinking that our spiritual growth is solely dependent on myself. How well I perform these routine tasks, these routine Christian actions without someone telling me to. Or maybe it's solely dependent on how well my Sunday school teacher teaches, or how well the sermons are, or how good my fellowship teacher leads. That's how I'm going to grow my spiritual growth. Or maybe it's thinking or wrestling with how much a church lacks in fulfilling my needs, how much a church doesn't fulfill what I desire, what I need to grow. Wrestling, ranting, complaining, maybe that's the childlike thoughts. But then if we were to change this now we look at what then would it look like if we were to take of this in the lens of Paul, where maturity and spiritual maturity is more defined by this vertical aspect of relying and depending on God, and this horizontal aspect of loving and being interdependent with others. Right? Maybe the switch then becomes, instead, is recognizing that we can't and don't need to do things on our own. That we need to learn how to be interdependent with others, depend on them and rely on them just as much as they'll depend and rely on us. It's not a solo job. Maybe it's recognizing that our spiritual growth isn't only dependent on ourselves. Yes, there is this individual aspect between us and God, but that's not all. There's more to it. There's this communal aspect, and also it's not us performing for God, but depending and relying on God. And lastly, there comes a time and there comes a place and there needs to be a spot to wrestle with how a church has failed, how a church misses out on fulfilling what we desire. But then there needs to be a space for follow-up. There needs to be a space to move forward, to act, to be part of the solution instead of complaining about the problem. Maturity and spiritual maturity needs to come from a place that recognizes we need God's love. And from that, we need to learn how to care, be considerate, and love others. I've only really gone over a little bit of what maturity is, and I've only covered a little bit of spiritual maturity. There's still emotional maturity, financial maturity. There's a bunch of other maturities that you guys can cook up. But I think this is a good place to start because I want us to recognize that spiritual maturity needs to be at the center of it all. Right? What it means to depend on God's love, practically speaking, for every one of us here that we can go home and do, it means that from the ways that God has loved you, you go and love others. Just as how God has been patient with you, every single one of you sitting here, through the sins we commit, through the ways we run away and try to turn away, He still waits patiently. He still pursues us. You can go and love others by pursuing and being patient with them. From the ways that God has provided you, and everyone sitting in these seats have been blessed more than you can imagine, have been privileged more than you can imagine. From that blessing, you can love others by blessing them. And lastly, from the ways that God has sacrificed for those of you here. The ways that He's brought His Son onto the cross for you, giving up His only Son. We can love others by sacrificing for them. I may not be asking you to give up your life, but you've got other things to give up, don't you? Time, money, resources, a listening ear, a helpful hand. That's what I mean when I say we need to depend and rely on God's love to then love others. Spiritual maturity isn't a job to be done on our own, but it's only when we're able to rely on God. Paul makes it clear here. Go ahead, you can try to do all the Christian things you think you are doing. Go ahead and clean up the chairs or set up the chairs or whatever it is that you do at church. It doesn't matter if you don't have love. So my challenge for us today from the question of are you mature is this. Maybe the ways that we've been thinking about maturity has been flawed. And so instead, let's look at it through Paul's eyes. Maturity is when we're able to be dependent on God's love, to then be interdependent with others. Let's pray. God, it is because of who you are that we can be sitting here today to listen, to wrestle with the idea of what it means to be mature, what it means to be spiritually mature. And for those of us here who desire to grow, we pray that you would be working in their hearts. For those of us here who desire to grow closer to you, to learn how to be more mature, God, we ask that you would move in their hearts, that your love would fill them and overflow from within them and pour into those around them. God, you didn't call us to a life on our own, but you've shown us that you are there by our side always, and you've put people by our side to walk with us. We thank you, and we pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.